The autumn mist descended on Portland like a funeral shroud, thick and suffocating, wrapping around Victorian lampposts and wrought iron fences as I stumbled through the Pearl District at 11:47 p.m. My breath came in ragged gasps that sent white plumes into the October air, each exhale a visible reminder that I was still alive, for now. Blood trickled from the corner of my mouth, the metallic taste mixing with rain and the copper tang of fear as I pressed one trembling hand against ribs that screamed with every desperate movement. 3 blocks. That's how far I'd made it from the apartment where Ansel Lawson, the man I'd once loved, the man who'd systematically destroyed every piece of my self-worth over 12 brutal months, had finally crossed the line from bruises hidden under long sleeves to hands wrapped around my throat. My vintage burgundy cardigan, the one I'd worn to work at Thornfield Antiquarian Books that morning, hung in tatters from my shoulders. The cream blouse beneath was torn at the collar, exposing the darkening fingerprint bruises that would take weeks to fade. If I survived the night. Rhea, sweetheart, you're being dramatic. His voice echoed off the brownstone facades, smooth and reasonable in that particular way that always preceded violence. That tone used to make me question my own reality, made me wonder if I was overreacting, if I deserved what came next. Come back to the car. We'll talk about this like adults. I'd believed those words once. Believed the apologies, the flowers delivered to my work, the promises whispered against my hair while I sobbed into his chest. Not anymore. Not after tonight, when his hands had finally moved from my arms to my throat, squeezing until darkness crept into the edges of my vision like ink bleeding through parchment. Not after I'd grabbed the antique letter opener from my restoration desk, the silver one with the mother-of-pearl handle that some long-dead merchant's wife had once used to open love letters, and driven it into his shoulder with enough force to buy myself 30 seconds to run. My ankle twisted on rain-slick cobblestones as I rounded the corner onto Burnside Street, and I went down hard. Palms scraped against wet stone, gravel embedding itself in skin already tender from defensive wounds. Pain shot up my leg, sharp and immediate, and for one terrifying moment I thought this was it. This was where Rhea Marigold's story ended at 27 years old, on a Portland street that smelled of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. That's when I saw it. Memento mori. The antiquarian bookshop materialized from the mist like something out of a fever dream, its bow windows glowing with warm amber light that had no business existing at midnight. The hand-painted sign above the door depicted a skull wreathed in roses, executed in gold leaf that caught the streetlight and threw it back in impossible directions. I knew every bookshop in Portland's historic district. It was my profession, my passion, the one thing Ansel hadn't managed to corrupt. But I'd never seen this place before. Couldn't have missed it, not with its Gothic revival architecture and that distinctive Victorian aesthetic. The door opened. He emerged like a prince from a dark fairy tale, impossibly tall and graceful in a way that made the laws of physics seem like suggestions rather than rules. A black wool coat fell to his knees, tailored with a precision that spoke of centuries rather than seasons, and beneath it I caught glimpses of charcoal wool and a vest embroidered with silver thread that formed patterns my eyes couldn't quite follow. His hair fell past his shoulders in waves of silver white that seemed to generate their own luminescence in the misty darkness, framing a face so perfectly sculpted it looked like something Bernini might have dreamed and been too afraid to carve. But it was his eyes that froze me in place, that made every rational thought evaporate like morning dew. Deep crimson, the color of vintage wine or fresh arterial blood, they caught the amber lamplight and reflected it back as something altogether different. Something older. Something that had no place in the modern world of coffee shops and craft breweries and food carts. When our gazes met, I felt something fundamental shift in the universe, like a lock tumbling into place after centuries of waiting. The air between us thickened, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand upright despite the cold rain soaking through my ruined clothes. Behind me, Ansel's footsteps grew closer. Rhea, I can see you. Stop making this harder than it needs to be. Couldn't think. Operating on pure instinct and the kind of desperation that makes people do impossible things, I lunged forward on my injured ankle and grabbed the stranger's hand. His skin was cold, not the chill of autumn air, but the profound cold of marble crypts and winter nights that never end. The contact sent a shock through my system that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the way his crimson eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the way his entire body went utterly still in a manner that no living thing should be able to achieve. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking around the word, around the blood in my mouth and the terror in my chest. "Please help me." For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, he said nothing. Just studied my face with those impossible eyes, taking in my soaked hair plastered to my skull, my torn clothes, my split lip, the bruises already blooming across my throat in the perfect shape of Ansel's fingers. His expression remained unreadable, carved from stone and shadow, but something flickered in the crimson depths. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. Then Ansel rounded the corner and everything changed. "Step away from my girlfriend." Ansel's voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed, the confidence of a pharmaceutical sales executive who'd learned to sell poison with a smile. "This is a private matter, friend. Keep walking." The stranger's gaze flicked past me, assessing Ansel with the casual precision of a predator evaluating prey. When he looked back down at me, still holding my hand in his freezing grasp, something almost like amusement touched the corners of his mouth. "She's claimed sanctuary," he said quietly, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't place. Something old and refined, vowels shaped by languages that had died before English was born. "The law is absolute. The blood protects the desperate, and the desperate have invoked protection." "What the hell are you talking about?" Ansel took another step forward, then stopped abruptly. His face had gone pale, all the drunken confidence draining away as he finally, really looked at the man whose hand I held. What are you?" "I am Balin Pellinore." The stranger's voice remained soft, conversational, but something in those words made Ansel take an involuntary step backward. "Vampire King of the Western Territories. Master of the Crimson Court. Keeper of the old laws. And this woman has invoked sanctuary under the Treaty of Shadows, which predates your nation by 7 centuries. The words should have been impossible. Should have sent me running as fast as my injured ankle would carry me. But Ansel's reaction, the sheer terror that transformed his features, the way he stumbled backward like a man who'd just seen death itself, told me everything I needed to know. Monsters were real. And I'd just grabbed the hand of their king. "The sanctuary law binds me to protect you now," Balin said, looking down at me with those crimson eyes that held centuries I couldn't begin to comprehend. "Until the threat to your life is neutralized. Do you accept?" Behind us, Ansel turned and ran, his footsteps echoing off the cobblestones as he fled into the mist. But I barely noticed. All I could focus on was the stranger, the vampire king, who held my hand with infinite gentleness, waiting for an answer that would change everything. I looked into those ancient eyes and made my choice. "Yes," I whispered. "I accept." The mist seemed to pulse once, like a heartbeat, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll midnight. Balin's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, and he drew me gently toward the impossible bookshop that had appeared exactly when I needed it most. "Then come," he said. "There is much to discuss, Rhea Marigold. And your life, I'm afraid, will never be simple again." As the door to Memento Mori closed behind us, shutting out the rain and the darkness and the man who'd tried to kill me, I realized I'd escaped one nightmare only to step directly into another. But this nightmare had crimson eyes and silver hair, treated me like I was made of glass, and had just promised to protect me with the weight of centuries behind the words. And somehow, impossibly, I believed him. Inside Memento Mori, the world transformed into something that belonged in manuscripts I'd spent years restoring rather than modern Portland. The bookshop was impossibly vast, defying every law of architecture and spatial reasoning I'd learned in my 7 years working with antiquarian collections. Shelves stretched upward into shadows that the amber lamplight couldn't penetrate, loaded with volumes whose spines bore text in languages I didn't recognize, some in alphabets that hurt to look at directly, as if the letters themselves rejected mortal comprehension. The air smelled of old leather and parchment with undertones of something else. Incense, maybe, or dried herbs that had been hanging in bundles from the exposed beams for longer than I'd been alive. Longer than anyone I knew had been alive. Sit. Balin's voice cut through my dazed observation, gentle but allowing no argument. He guided me to a wing-back chair upholstered in burgundy velvet that had probably been stitched together before the Civil War. You're going into shock. I wanted to argue to maintain some semblance of control, but my legs gave out the moment I tried to lower myself into the seat. He caught me with reflexes that were physically impossible, moving faster than my eyes could track, and settled me into the chair with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything I thought I knew about predators. His hands were steady as he examined my injuries, those crimson eyes tracking across the bruises on my throat with an expression that might have been fury on someone whose face moved more naturally. He produced a first aid kit from somewhere, an ornate wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl that looked like it had survived the Victorian era, and began cleaning the scrapes on my palms with antiseptic that stung like holy water. "Your ribs," he said quietly. "Not a question. How many did he crack?" "2, I think. Maybe 3. The words came out steadier than I felt. "I've had worse." Something dangerous flickered across his features. "You shouldn't have had any." I watched him work, trying to reconcile the creature before me with every vampire myth I'd absorbed through pop culture and gothic literature. He moved with preternatural grace, but there was nothing theatrical about it. No cape, no melodrama, just centuries of practice making every gesture economical and precise. His hands, despite their coldness, were careful around my injuries in a way Ansel's had never been even when he wasn't angry. "You're not breathing," I said suddenly, the observation escaping before I could stop it. "Your chest isn't moving. At all." Balin's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Very observant. Most humans don't notice for hours, sometimes days. They're too distracted by other discrepancies. Like the eyes. Or the way you moved when you caught me. Or the fact that this bookshop is somehow 3 times larger inside than the building's external dimensions would allow." I was babbling now, shock and adrenaline making me reckless. "Or maybe the part where you claimed to be a vampire king and my abusive ex-boyfriend ran away like you'd pulled a gun? All valid points." He finished bandaging my palms and sat back, studying me with those impossible eyes. "You're handling this better than most." "I'm handling nothing. I'm barely holding it together." My voice cracked on the last word and I hated myself for it. This morning I was restoring a 15th century book of hours. Tonight I'm sitting in an impossible bookshop while something that shouldn't exist patches up the damage from my boyfriend trying to kill me. "I'm not handling anything." "Former boyfriend," Balin corrected quietly. "And he won't touch you again." The absolute certainty in his voice should have comforted me. Instead, it triggered a different kind of fear. "What are you going to do to him?" Before he could answer, the bookshop's door opened with a soft chime that sounded like distant church bells. A man entered, tall, dark-haired, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that looked tailored on Savile Row. His eyes were the same crimson as Balin's, though somehow colder, and when they landed on me, I felt evaluated and found wanting in the space of a heartbeat. "Balin." The newcomer's voice carried a British accent and barely concealed irritation. "Care to explain why the sanctuary ward's activated?" "We haven't had an invocation in." He stopped abruptly, staring at me with something between disbelief and disgust. "A human? In this political climate? She's either incredibly lucky or a plant." "Lucian." There was warning in Balin's tone. "This is Rhea Marigold. She invoked sanctuary under the Treaty of Shadows." The law was clear. Lucian, apparently Balin's second-in-command based on the way he moved through the space with proprietary confidence, crossed his arms. "Do you have any idea what Morrigan will do with this? You've handed her ammunition on a silver platter. Morrigan can take her objections to the Crimson Court." Balin rose from where he'd been kneeling beside my chair, and I was struck again by how tall he was. Well over 6 feet, with the kind of presence that made the already impossible bookshop feel smaller. "The law predates her rebellion by 6 centuries. I won't break covenant because she's decided humans are beneath our protection." I cleared my throat, drawing both sets of crimson eyes to me. "I'm sorry, but what exactly is the Treaty of Shadows? And who's Morrigan? And what's the Crimson Court? Because 5 minutes ago I thought vampires were fictional, and now I'm apparently at the center of some kind of political situation I don't understand. Lucian looked at Balin with an expression that clearly said, "This is your problem, not mine," and disappeared deeper into the bookshop's shadows with that same impossible speed. Balin returned to his position near my chair, though he remained standing this time. The Treaty of Shadows was signed in 1247, after decades of war between vampires and humans nearly destroyed both populations. It established rules of engagement, territories, and protections for both sides. One of those protections is the law of sanctuary. Any human who invokes it by grasping a vampire's hand while in mortal danger is granted protection until the threat is neutralized. That's oddly specific. My mind was racing, trying to fit this information into any kind of logical framework. How was I supposed to know that rule existed? You weren't. The law works on instinct and desperation, not knowledge. You reached for help and I was there. The magic recognized your need and bound us together until you're safe. He paused, something unreadable flickering across his features. I am Balin Pellinore, Vampire King of the Western Territories, which encompasses everything from the Pacific coast to the Rocky Mountains. The law you've invoked is absolute. Until the threat to your life is neutralized, you are under my protection. The weight of those words settled over me like a physical thing. Protection. I'd spent 12 months learning that word was just another term for control, that Ansel's protection meant isolation from friends, monitoring my phone, deciding what I wore and where I went and who I could speak to. The thought of trading one cage for another, even one with impossibly beautiful architecture and a captor who treated my injuries with reverence, made my chest tighten with something beyond physical pain. I need to think. I stood up too quickly and the room tilted. Balin caught me again, his cold hands steadying me with that same careful gentleness. This close, I could see details I'd missed before. The way his silver hair held hints of moonlight, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he'd once been human enough to smile, the complete absence of a pulse in the wrist that supported my elbow. And something else. Something I couldn't quite name. When I looked at him, really looked, I saw layers. Not physically, but something more essential. Colors that shouldn't exist, patterns of light and shadow that moved independently of the lamps. It was like seeing double vision, except one version was the man before me and the other was something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. You can see it, Balin said quietly, and there was wonder in his voice. You can see my aura. That's extremely unusual for humans. Is that what that is? I stepped back, needing distance, needing to process. The way you look, like you're made of crimson light and shadows that remember what sunlight used to feel like. Silence stretched between us, heavy with implications I couldn't begin to understand. Finally, Balin spoke, his voice careful. Most humans can't perceive vampire auras. Those who can usually have particular bloodlines. Old families who hunted us or were hunted by us centuries ago. A memory surfaced. My grandmother Colette, who'd emigrated from Belgium in the 50s, telling stories about our family history that I'd dismissed as folklore. Stories about ancestors who'd hunted monsters in the dark forests of medieval Europe. Stories I'd laughed off as fairy tales meant to entertain children. This is insane, I whispered. All of this. You're telling me vampires are real, there are treaties and territories and political situations. I can see things humans aren't supposed to see. And I'm now magically bound to the protection of an 800-year-old king because I grabbed your hand while running from a man who tried to kill me? 847 years old, Balin corrected with that slight curve of his lips. But yes, that's accurate. The absurdity of it hit me then. Not the horror, not the impossibility, but the sheer cosmic joke of my situation. I started laughing, high and slightly hysterical, and couldn't seem to stop. Tears streamed down my face, mixing with the blood I'd wiped from my split lip, and Balin just waited with the patience of someone who'd watched centuries pass. When I finally got myself under control, I met his crimson gaze directly. I need your word on something. Name it. I'm not trading one cage for another. I don't care what your law says or how absolute it is. I need your word that when this is over, when Ansel is no longer a threat, I can leave. That you won't try to keep me, won't manipulate me into staying, won't use this protection as an excuse for control. My voice was steady now, hardened by 12 months of learning to recognize the patterns of possession disguised as care. I need your word that I'm not just exchanging one monster for another. Something shifted in Balin's expression. Not anger at the accusation, but something deeper. Pain, perhaps, or recognition of wounds that transcended the physical. You have my word, he said quietly. I haven't taken anyone's freedom in 3 centuries. I won't start with yours. He moved to a mahogany desk that probably predated the American Revolution and pulled out a card embossed with silver script. I have a secure residence in the West Hills, Blackthorn Estate. You'll be safe there while we investigate your former partner and determine the full extent of the threat he poses. And if I say no? Then I'll arrange alternative protection. A hotel with security perhaps, or a safe house. But Rhea, his crimson eyes met mine with uncomfortable directness. Ansel Lawson saw me tonight. Saw what I am. That makes this more complicated than a simple domestic situation. He'll either run terrified, which solves your problem, or he'll seek help from others in the supernatural world, which creates an entirely different problem. The memory of earlier that evening came flooding back then. Ansel cornering me in our apartment, my announcement that I was leaving triggering rage that had been building for months. His hands around my throat. The letter opener in his shoulder. The desperate flight through rain-soaked streets. And his face when he'd seen Balin. The recognition in his eyes that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with the impossible. He knew what you were, I said slowly. When he looked at you, he wasn't surprised. Scared but not surprised. Yes. Balin's voice was grim. Which means he has connections to our world already. Which means this situation is more dangerous than either of us anticipated. I looked around the impossible bookshop, at the shadows that stretched into infinity and the books that held knowledge I'd spent my life pursuing without knowing what I was really searching for. I thought about my small apartment that I'd never felt safe in, about Ansel's key that he refused to return, about the way I'd been sleeping with a chair jammed under my bedroom doorknob. Your estate, I said finally. It has a library? That not-quite smile touched Balin's lips again. 3 of them. Then I'll accept your protection. On my terms. With the understanding that this is temporary, that I'm not your prisoner or your possession, and that when this is over I walk away free. Balin inclined his head, a gesture that belonged to courts and coronations. On your terms. You have my word, Rhea Marigold. And in 8 centuries I've never broken an oath. As he moved to make arrangements, I caught sight of my reflection in an antique mirror hanging between shelves. Bruised, bloodied, torn clothing, but eyes that held something I hadn't seen in months. Not hope exactly, but possibility. The possibility that survival might lead somewhere beyond just existing in fear. I'd grabbed a stranger's hand and invoked ancient laws I didn't understand. But for the first time in a year I wasn't alone in the dark. And if he proved to be another monster? Well, at least this one had promised me freedom. And somehow, impossibly, I believed him. Blackthorn Estate rose from Portland's West Hills like something out of a gothic romance. All Victorian spires and widows' walks shrouded in ancient Douglas firs that had been old when Lewis and Clark first saw the Pacific. The car, a vintage Rolls-Royce that probably cost more than I'd earn in a lifetime, glided up the circular drive as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold that Balin would never see without pain. He'd already retreated to whatever chambers he kept for daylight hours, leaving me in the capable hands of a housekeeper named Petra who looked about 60 and moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been managing impossible households for decades. She didn't blink at my torn clothes or bruised throat, just showed me to a guest suite on the 2nd floor that was larger than my entire apartment. The room was a study in Victorian elegance, 4-poster bed with burgundy velvet curtains, mahogany furniture that predated the Civil War, and windows that overlooked gardens gone wild with autumn roses. A bathroom attached, all marble and brass fixtures with a clawfoot tub deep enough to drown in. Clean clothes had been laid out on the bed in exactly my size, which should have been creepy but was instead just another impossible detail in an increasingly impossible situation. I slept until noon, the kind of dreamless sleep that comes from complete exhaustion, and woke to find more clothes in the wardrobe. Jeans, sweaters, even undergarments that fit perfectly. Either Balin had exceptional estimation skills or there was some kind of magic involved I didn't want to think about. The estate was silent as I explored, my footsteps muffled by Persian rugs that had survived centuries. I found the first library on the second floor. A modest room with perhaps 2,000 volumes on everything from medieval history to modern philosophy. The second library was on the ground floor, specializing in literature and poetry spanning 6 languages. But it was the third library, hidden behind a door marked private, that I absolutely shouldn't have opened, that changed everything. This wasn't a library. It was an archive of the impossible. Manuscripts bound in leather that might have been human, grimoires whose pages seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, genealogies tracking bloodlines back to when history dissolved into legend. I moved through the stacks in a daze, my restorer's instincts cataloging treasures that museums would kill for, until I found the volume that made my blood turn to ice water. Lineages of the Hunt. A compendium of families bound by the Treaty of Shadows. My hands trembled as I opened it, scanning through centuries of names written in different hands, different inks, marking births and deaths and the occasional note about lost to the darkness, or turned by necessity. And there, halfway through, written in elegant copperplate script dated 1247, Marigold of the Belgian territories. Associates of Van Helsing. Bound by blood and oath to hunt the night. Your ancestors were quite formidable. The voice came from behind me, cultured and ancient, with an accent that suggested French courts and palace intrigue. Abraham Van Helsing's name is more famous, but the Marigolds were the true scholars. They understood what they hunted. I spun to find a woman standing in the doorway, elegant in a way that transcended fashion or era. She looked perhaps 40, with auburn hair swept into a chignon and eyes that were the deep crimson of arterial blood. Her dress was simple but clearly expensive, midnight blue silk that moved like water, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd navigated centuries of social politics. Seraphine Vale, she introduced herself with a slight incline of her head. Balin's senior advisor. And you must be Rhea Marigold, the human who's caused such a delightful commotion in our otherwise predictable court. I didn't mean to cause anything. I closed the volume carefully, aware that I'd been caught somewhere I probably shouldn't be. I was just exploring. And found your family history. How convenient. Seraphine moved into the room with that same impossible grace they all seemed to possess, studying me with uncomfortable intensity. A Van Helsing descendant. No wonder the sanctuary lore resonated so strongly. Your bloodline was written into the original treaty. Your ancestors helped negotiate it after they realized they were losing the war. The implications crashed over me like a wave. My family hunted vampires. For generations. Some of the most skilled hunters in European history. Seraphine pulled another volume from the shelf, flipping to a page marked with a pressed flower that had somehow retained its color for centuries. But they were also scholars who understood that mutual destruction served neither species. They helped establish the laws that keep us all alive. And now I've invoked one of those laws for protection from a human threat. The irony wasn't lost on me. My ancestors are probably rolling in their graves. Your ancestors would be proud you survived. Seraphine's voice carried unexpected warmth. The Marigolds always valued survival over pride. It's why your line has persisted when so many others died out. Before I could respond, Lucien appeared in the doorway with his characteristic abruptness. Seraphine. Balin wants you in his study. We have a situation. His crimson eyes flicked to me with barely concealed irritation. Your former partner is more connected than we anticipated. The study was on the 3rd floor, all dark wood and leather-bound books, with heavy curtains blocking any hint of afternoon sunlight. Balin stood behind a massive desk, looking like he'd stepped out of a pre-Raphaelite painting despite the modern laptop open before him. He'd changed into dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and I found myself noticing details I shouldn't. The way his silver hair caught lamplight, the elegant lines of his hands, the intensity with which he focused on the screen. Ansel Lawson, Lucian said without preamble, pulling up files on his own tablet. Pharmaceutical sales executive for Nightshade Pharmaceuticals. Top performer transferred to Portland 6 months ago from Sacramento. Which happens to be exactly when he entered your life. My stomach dropped. You think that's a coincidence? I think nothing involving Nightshade Pharmaceuticals is ever a coincidence. Balin's voice was grim. The company is owned through a series of shell corporations, but we've traced it back to Morgan Nightshade. She's been building a power base in the pharmaceutical industry for the last decade. Who's Morgan? I asked, though some instinct told me I wasn't going to like the answer. Seraphine and Lucian exchanged glances. Finally, Seraphine spoke. Morgan Nightshade is a 600-year-old vampire who believes Balin's rule has made our kind weak. She thinks we should dominate humans rather than coexist with them. She's been challenging his authority in the Crimson Court for decades, building alliances with more traditional vampires who remember the old ways. And if she knew about my bloodline, I said slowly, pieces clicking together, she'd want to use me somehow. But how would she even know I existed? That, Balin said quietly, is what concerns me most. I moved to the window, careful to stay away from the slice of sunlight that penetrated where the curtains didn't quite meet. I need to call my sister. June's at University of Oregon in Eugene. If Ansel knows about her. Already done. Lucian held up his phone. I have people watching her dorm. She's safe for now. For now. My voice rose despite my attempt to stay calm. She's 19 years old. She has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this if Ansel decides to use her as leverage. Balin's tone was gentle but firm. Call her. Warn her. But don't tell her too much. The less she knows, the safer she is. The conversation with June was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Explaining that my ex was dangerous, that she needed to be careful, that I was somewhere safe but couldn't say where, all without mentioning vampires or ancient treaties or the fact that I'd discovered our family had once hunted creatures of the night. She was scared but trying to hide it, putting on the brave face she'd perfected when our mother died 3 years ago. Rhea, what's really going on? She asked finally. This isn't just about Ansel being a creep, is it? It's complicated. But I promise I'll explain everything when it's safe. Just please, June. Stay on campus, stay with friends, and if Ansel contacts you, don't engage. Call me immediately. After I hung up, Balin was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She sounds strong. She is. She's had to be. I set the phone down carefully. Our mother died when June was 16. Car accident. I've been looking after her since. And who looks after you? The question caught me off guard. I look after myself. Until tonight when you couldn't. There was no judgment in his voice, just observation. That must be difficult for someone who's used to being the protector. Before I could formulate a response, Petra appeared in the doorway. Your Majesty, the court is assembling. Lady Nightshade has requested an audience. The throne room, because of course a vampire king had a throne room, was on the estate's ground floor, hidden behind what looked like a wine cellar from the outside. Inside, it was all vaulted ceilings and gothic arches, with a dais at one end where Balin's throne stood carved from black wood and inlaid with silver. Vampires filled the space, perhaps 30 of them, dressed in everything from modern suits to clothing that belonged in costume dramas. They were beautiful, every one of them, with the kind of predatory grace that made my hindbrain scream warnings my rational mind tried to override. And they all turned to stare as Balin entered with me at his side, their crimson eyes assessing and finding me wanting in ways I couldn't begin to articulate. Then Morgan Nightshade made her entrance, and I understood why everyone else paled in comparison. She was breathtaking in the way natural disasters are breathtaking, terrible and magnificent and impossible to look away from. Raven black hair fell in waves past her waist, framing a face that could have launched ships or ended kingdoms. Her dress was crimson silk that clung to curves that defied anatomy, and her eyes, darker crimson than any I'd seen, held centuries of calculated ambition. Your Majesty. Her voice was honey over steel. How domestic. Sheltering strays now. Lady Nightshade. Balin's tone could have frozen blood. The law of sanctuary was invoked. I had no choice. No choice. She laughed, the sound like breaking glass. The law has loopholes, as you well know. You could have directed her to another protector. You could have claimed prior commitment. But you chose to shelter her personally. Her gaze fixed on me and I felt pinned like an insect under glass. A Van Helsing descendant. How fascinating. Tell me, little huntress, do you know what your ancestors did to my family? I only just learned my family history existed a few hours ago, I said, proud that my voice stayed steady. So no, I don't know what they did. But I'm guessing it wasn't pleasant. They burned my sister alive. Morrigan's smile never wavered. Staked my father through the heart while he slept. Slaughtered my entire bloodline over 3 years of systematic hunting. And now their descendant stands under the protection of the vampire king himself, shielded by laws those same ancestors helped write. She turned back to Balin. Your Majesty, sheltering a Van Helsing is an insult to every vampire who lost family to the hunts. Have you forgotten what her kind did to ours? I have forgotten nothing. Balin's voice carried the weight of centuries. Including the fact that the Van Helsings and their associates helped negotiate the treaty that ended the war. Including the fact that those same families swore oaths to uphold the laws they helped create. Including the fact that this woman is not responsible for crimes committed by ancestors dead for generations. He leaned forward slightly. The law is clear. I will not break covenant because you've chosen to hold ancient grudges. The tension in the room was suffocating. Vampires whispered among themselves, clearly divided in their support. Morrigan's smile sharpened into something dangerous. How noble, she purred. How very soft. This is why our kind grows weak under your rule, Balin. You coddle humans. Make treaties with prey. Forget what we are. She turned to address the assembled court. We are predators. We are the night-made flesh. We do not beg for protection from the descendants of those who hunted us. We take what we need and destroy what threatens us. If you wish to formally challenge my rule, Morrigan, you know the process. Balin's tone was bored, which somehow made him more dangerous. Until then, I suggest you remember who holds this throne and why. Morrigan's exit was as dramatic as her entrance, sweeping out with several vampires following in her wake. The court dispersed slowly and I found myself alone with Balin in the vast space, my heart still hammering from the confrontation. You used me, I said quietly. You knew bringing me here would provoke her. Knew it would force some kind of conflict. I could have refused the sanctuary. Balin's admission was stark. The law has loopholes, as Morrigan noted. I could have directed you to another protector or claimed prior commitment. I chose not to use them. Why? He was quiet for a long moment, those crimson eyes studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Because when you grabbed my hand, I felt something I haven't felt in 3 centuries. Interest. Curiosity. The desire to know another being beyond tactical assessment. He moved closer and I caught a hint of his scent. Old books and winter nights and something indefinably ancient. You looked at me like I was your last hope, Rhea. Not a monster. Not a political tool. Just someone who might help. Do you know how rare that is? How utterly unprecedented. So what am I to you? My voice came out shakier than I wanted. A curiosity? A political statement? A way to provoke your enemies? You're someone I want to keep alive. The simple honesty in his voice was more devastating than any flowery declaration. And yes, perhaps you're also someone who makes me remember what it was like to be human. To care about something beyond territories and treaties and the endless dance of court politics. I haven't felt anything in centuries. You make me feel. The admission hung between us, vulnerable and dangerous. I should have stepped back, maintained distance, remembered that this was a creature who'd lived for 8 centuries and could manipulate me in ways I couldn't begin to understand. But something in his expression, something lost and lonely and ancient beyond measure, kept me frozen in place. My phone shattered the moment, Ivy's ringtone cutting through the tension. I answered immediately, stepping away from Balin to focus on my best friend's voice. Rhea, thank God. I need the sound of breaking glass. Ivy scream. Then Ansel's voice, smooth and reasonable as ever. Hello, Rhea. I've been trying to reach you. Your friend Ivy here was just telling me she doesn't know where you are. I don't think she's lying, but I thought maybe you'd like to confirm that before I... Don't touch her. My voice cracked. Ansel, whatever you're planning. Come home, Rhea. Come back to the apartment and we'll talk about this like adults. Or I'll take your whole world apart piece by piece, starting with the tattoo artist who keeps giving you ideas about leaving me. The line went dead. I stood frozen, the phone falling from numb fingers as Balin's hand closed gently on my shoulder. Where? Was all he said. Her shop. Ivy's ink on Hawthorne. Ansel has her. Then we go get your friend back. His voice was steel wrapped in velvet. And Ansel Lawson learns what happens when humans threaten those under my protection. As Lucien materialized with weapons and tactical plans, as Seraphine made calls to mobilize resources, I realized something that should have terrified me but instead brought cold clarity. I was done running. Done being victim. If Ansel wanted a war, he just declared it against forces he couldn't begin to comprehend. And I was going to watch his world burn. The tactical planning happened with military precision in Balin's study. Maps of Portland spread across the desk alongside what looked like century-old blueprints of the Hawthorne district. Lucien moved chess pieces across the map. Black for vampires, white for potential threats, while Seraphine made calls in rapid French to mobilize resources I didn't understand. I'm coming with you, I said, cutting through their strategic discussion. 3 sets of crimson eyes turned to me. Lucien's expression was pure disbelief. Absolutely not. You're the asset we're protecting, not tactical support. She's my best friend. I won't hide while people I love are hurt because of me. I planted my hands on the desk, meeting Balin's gaze directly. Besides, I know Ansel. I know his patterns, his tells, how he thinks. That's worth something. It's worth getting yourself killed, Lucien snapped. Enough. Balin's voice cut through the argument with absolute authority. He studied me for a long moment and I saw the calculation happening behind those ancient eyes, weighing my value against the risk, measuring my determination against his responsibility. What patterns? I pulled the map closer, pointing to the tattoo parlor's layout that I knew by heart from hundreds of visits. Ansel likes control. He'll position himself where he can see all exits but has his own escape route. Back room, probably near the rear door. He'll have the lights bright, he hates shadows, hates not seeing everything clearly. And he'll be armed. He always carries in his ankle holster, thinks I don't know about it. Personality assessment? Seraphine's question was clinical. Narcissist with authority complex. He'll want to talk, to explain himself, to make me understand why this is all my fault. That's his weakness. He needs validation even when he's threatening someone. The words came easier than they should have. Distance and vampire protection, making it possible to analyze the man who'd terrorized me for a year. Use that. Make him talk. He'll tell you everything if he thinks he's winning. Balin's expression shifted subtly. Approval, perhaps, or recognition. She comes. But stays in the vehicle unless I say otherwise. Lucien looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Balin's tone made him nod instead. Your Majesty. The drive to Hawthorne took 20 minutes that felt like hours. I sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce next to Balin, watching Portland's nighttime streets blur past, trying not to think about Ivy, terrified and hurt because of me. Balin's hand found mine in the darkness, his cold fingers intertwining with my warm ones in a gesture that should have been disturbing but was instead oddly comforting. She'll be alive, he said quietly. Ansel needs leverage. Dead hostages provide none. You don't know him like I do. When he gets angry enough, then we'll be fast. The certainty in his voice was absolute. I've been saving lives for 8 centuries, Rhea. I won't stop now. Ivy's ink was dark except for the harsh fluorescent lights blazing in the back room, exactly as I'd predicted. The front windows showed overturned furniture and scattered ink bottles, black liquid spreading across hardwood like blood. Lucien and 3 other vampires I didn't know moved through the shadows with predatory silence, surrounding the building while Seraphine stayed with me in the car. He's fascinating, isn't he? Seraphine's voice was conversational. Our king. 800 years old and he still feels everything so deeply. Most of us learn to numb ourselves by century 3. Balin never did. Is that a warning? I kept my eyes on the tattoo parlor's back entrance. An observation. He hasn't cared about anyone beyond tactical necessity in 3 centuries. You've undone that in 3 days. She glanced at me, crimson eyes unreadable. Just be careful, little huntress. Breaking an ancient vampire's heart tends to have consequences. Before I could respond, Balin moved. I'd seen him fast before, but this was different. Lethal grace combined with centuries of combat experience. He flowed through the back door like smoke, and seconds later I heard the sounds of violence. I was out of the car before Seraphine could stop me, running toward the parlor despite every instinct screaming at me to stay safe. But Ivy was in there and I was done letting other people fight my battles. The back room was carnage. Balin had one of Morgan's vampires pinned against the wall by his throat, feet dangling inches off the ground, while another lay crumpled in the corner with his neck at an impossible angle. Lucien held Ansel face down on the floor, knee pressed between his shoulder blades. And Ivy, God, Ivy was cable-tied to a chair, her face bruised and her professional smile despite everything expression cracking when she saw me. You came, Ansel gasped, turning his head as much as Lucien allowed. I knew you would. You're so predictable, Rhea. So desperate to save everyone. Where's the third one? Balin's voice was lethal calm as he increased pressure on the vampire's throat. The creature made choking sounds despite not needing to breathe. Left when you arrived, the vampire wheezed. Told Morgan. The huntress has protection. Balin's hand moved almost casually and I heard something crack. The vampire slumped and I realized with distant horror that I'd just watched someone die. That Balin had killed without hesitation, without rage, with the efficient precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times. He should have terrified me. Should have sent me running back to the car, remembering that monsters wearing beautiful faces were still monsters. But instead I felt something complicated and uncomfortable. Horror at the violence, yes, but also recognition that he'd done it to protect Ivy. To protect me. That he was terrible and efficient but never cruel, never sadistic. Rhea, sweetheart. Ansel's voice pulled my attention back. We need to talk about this. About us. This vampire has you confused, but we can work through it. We always do. I moved closer, crouching so we were at eye level. There is no us, Ansel. There hasn't been for months. Maybe there never was. Maybe you were always just playing a role Morgan gave you. Something flickered in his eyes, surprised that I knew. You think this is about you? You think I spent 18 months pretending to love you because I wanted you? He laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. You're just the key, Rhea. Your blood is the weapon she's been looking for. Van Helsing blood that can neutralize vampire abilities, make them vulnerable, make them mortal for precious minutes. The room went absolutely silent. Balin released the dead vampire, letting him drop, and moved toward us with terrible purpose. Explain. Now. Why should I? You're going to kill me anyway. Ansel's bravado was cracking, fear bleeding through. I'm going to kill you slowly or quickly depending on how cooperative you are. Balin's voice held no inflection, no emotion, just certainty. Choose. What spilled out over the next minutes painted a picture more horrifying than I'd imagined. Morgan had been planning this for years, identified my bloodline through old records, had Ansel transferred to Portland specifically to get close to me, orchestrated our relationship to make me desperate enough to seek supernatural protection when it inevitably turned violent. The pharmaceutical company was producing synthetic blood laced with compounds from Van Helsing research, slowly poisoning vampires while appearing to sustain them. And my blood, living Van Helsing blood, could be weaponized to neutralize vampire powers completely. The blood moon ball, Ansel finished, his voice breaking. She's going to challenge Balin publicly. And when he's weak from the poisoned blood his supporters have been drinking, when his court is divided, she'll use you to finish him. Turn the huntress's descendant into the weapon that kills the vampire king. Balin didn't kill him. That honor went to Lucian, quick and efficient, before we freed Ivy and carried her to the car. She was shaking, traumatized but resilient, her tattoo artist's hands still steady as she touched my face. "You're really okay?" Her voice cracked. "He said such awful things about what he'd done to you. What he'd make you watch him do to me. I'm okay. I'm safe." I held her hands, aware that Balin was giving us space, standing guard near the car with Seraphine. "Ivy, I need to tell you something that's going to sound insane. More insane than being kidnapped by your abusive ex and two guys with fangs?" She laughed, slightly hysterical. "Try me." So I told her. About vampires and treaties and the fact that I'd grabbed the hand of their king. About my family history and Morrigan's plan and the impossible situation I'd stumbled into. Ivy listened with widening eyes, occasionally glancing at Balin like she was confirming he was real. And when I finished she was quiet for a long moment. "So you're dating a vampire king?" she finally said. "That's either the best rebound or the worst decision ever. I genuinely can't tell which." "I'm not dating him. He's protecting me because of an ancient law." "Rhea. Honey. I've known you since freshman year of college. I've seen you look at exactly 3 men with that expression and 2 of them were movie characters." She touched my hand gently. "Just be careful, okay? I don't want you trading one controlling relationship for another." The words hit harder than they should have. I stayed too long with Ansel. Made excuses for him. I don't know how to trust my judgment anymore. "You survived." Ivy's voice was fierce. "That's not failure. You survived a man who was literally assigned to destroy you by an ancient vampire conspiracy." And grabbing that man's hand. She nodded toward where Balin stood. "That was your instinct saving your life. Maybe trust that." Back at Blackthorn, Ivy settled into a guest room with surprising adaptability, claiming she'd always known something weird was going on in Portland. Lucian provided her with medical attention and sedatives she refused, and within an hour she was asleep while I paced the library unable to settle. "Can't sleep." Balin's voice came from the doorway and I realized I'd been hoping he'd find me. Lucian discovered something. I held up the file he'd left on the desk. "Nightshade Pharmaceuticals. They've been producing synthetic blood for vampires who don't want to hunt humans anymore. Except the formula contains compounds derived from Van Helsing family research. It slowly poisons vampires while appearing to sustain them." Balin moved into the room, taking the file from my hands. His jaw tightened as he read. "How many of my court have been using this?" "According to Lucian's estimates, about 40%, including some of your closest supporters." I wrapped my arms around myself. "Morrigan's been weakening your power base for years and no one noticed. She's brilliant." There was reluctant admiration in his voice. "Diabolical but brilliant. Poison the king's supporters, wait for the perfect moment to strike, and use the descendant of his ancient enemies as the final weapon." He set the file down carefully. "She's planned this for decades." I found myself drawn to the Van Helsing journals I'd been reading earlier, leather-bound volumes written in elegant script that detailed hunts and kills with clinical precision. "My ancestors killed people like you. Staked them while they slept. Burned them in their homes. Slaughtered entire families. People like me killed people like you." Balin moved to stand beside me, and I was hyper-aware of the cold radiating from him, the way his presence filled spaces. Drained villages. Turned children into eternal predators. Waged war for territory and sustenance. We're both carrying histories we didn't choose, Rhea. The question is whether we're brave enough to write different ones. His hand covered mine on the journal's cover, cold fingers intertwining with my warm ones. "I want to show you something. A way to sense vampire presences before you see them. Your bloodline has dormant abilities. The journals mention it. Hunters who could feel predators approaching, who knew when they were being stalked. Magic." The word felt strange on my tongue. Instinct refined over generations. He turned my hand palm up, tracing patterns on my skin that made me shiver. "Close your eyes. Feel the room around you. Not with sight but with that deeper sense you used to perceive my aura." I obeyed, shutting out the library's visual details and focusing on feeling. The first nothing. Then slowly I became aware of presences. Balin beside me, cold and ancient and vast, like standing next to a glacier. Lucien somewhere in the house, sharper and more predatory. Seraphine, elegant and controlled. And farther away, other vampires, some familiar from the court gathering, their presences like candle flames in the darkness of my perception. You feel us. Balin's voice was close to my ear, sending shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with fear. Your ancestors would have been proud. When I opened my eyes, he was closer than before, his crimson gaze fixed on my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. The air between us felt charged, dangerous, full of possibilities I shouldn't be considering. His hand still held mine, thumb tracing slow circles on my palm that shouldn't have been as distracting as they were. Balin, I started, not knowing how to finish. The door burst open. Seraphine entered, her usual composure cracked by urgency. We have a problem. Matthias Grayson was just found dead in his apartment. Synthetic blood poisoning. He was one of your oldest supporters. Balin's hand dropped from mine and I immediately missed the contact. His expression shifted back to the Vampire King's mask. Controlled, calculating, lethal. How many more? We're checking now. But Rhea, there's more. Seraphine's crimson eyes found mine. The Blood Moon Ball is in 3 days. Morrigan will challenge Balin publicly, and with his supporters weakened or dead, the court will be divided. She's been building toward this for decades. Then we need to find Ansel and Morrigan before the ball. I surprised myself with the steadiness in my voice. Because I'm not letting her use me as a weapon. If she wants Van Helsing blood, she's going to have to take it by force. And I'm done being anyone's victim. Balin's expression shifted, not quite a smile but something close. Approval, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. Then we prepare for war. As Seraphine left to coordinate defenses, as Lucien called in reinforcements from allied territories, I stood in the library surrounded by journals chronicling centuries of violence between my kind and Balin's. And I realized something that should have terrified me but instead brought cold clarity. I'd spent a year being afraid of a human monster. I wasn't going to spend another day being afraid of anything. If Morrigan Nightshade wanted a war, she was about to learn what Van Helsing blood could do when it stopped running and started fighting back. The Blood Moon Ball transformed Blackthorn Estate into something from a fever dream. Hundreds of vampires from across the Western Territories filling the ballroom in a display of ancient power and predatory elegance that made my breath catch despite 3 days of preparation. They wore everything from Victorian formal wear to modern designer suits, all crimson eyes and impossible beauty, moving through the space with the confidence of apex predators who'd forgotten what fear felt like. I wore midnight blue silk that Seraphine had procured from somewhere, the fabric falling in elegant lines that suggested strength rather than fragility. Not red, I refused to dress like prey or possession, refused to play the role Morgan expected. My hair was swept up in a style that exposed the bruises on my throat, now faded to yellow-green but still visible. Let them see what I'd survived. Let them understand I wasn't some helpless human who'd stumbled into their world by accident. They're testing you, Balin murmured, his hand at the small of my back as we moved through the crowd. He looked devastating in black formal wear, his silver hair pulled back to reveal the sharp planes of his face, every inch the ancient king. Evaluating whether you're worthy of my protection. And what's the verdict? I asked, aware of how many crimson eyes tracked our movement. Divided. Some see strength. Others see weakness waiting to be exploited. His fingers pressed slightly against my spine. Show them strength, Rhea. They respect nothing else. The political maneuvering was exhausting. Vampires approaching with false courtesy to ask pointed questions about my bloodline, my intentions, whether I understood the honor Balin bestowed by sheltering me. I answered with the same careful precision I used when authenticating rare manuscripts, revealing nothing while appearing transparent, and saw grudging respect in some of those ancient eyes. Then the music stopped. The crowd parted like water. Morrigan Nightshade made her entrance like a conquering queen, wearing crimson silk that clung to impossible curves and moved like liquid blood. Her raven hair was swept up in an elaborate style that had probably been fashionable during the Renaissance, and her dark crimson eyes held triumph as she surveyed the assembled court. She wasn't alone. Ansel walked beside her, looking almost casual in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the bandage on his shoulder where I'd stabbed him. And between them, bound and gagged, was June, my baby sister, her college sweatshirt torn and her eyes wide with terror above the gag. The world tilted. My knees threatened to give out, and only Balin's hand kept me upright as rage and horror flooded through me in equal measure. June. They'd taken June, who had nothing to do with this, who was supposed to be safe in Eugene surrounded by Lucien's people. Your Majesty. Morrigan's voice carried through the silent ballroom like a blade. How lovely. You've assembled your court to witness your downfall. How efficient. She pushed June forward slightly and my sister stumbled, catching herself before she fell. I claim right of contest. You've violated our most sacred law by bonding with Van Helsing blood. Release her to me or face me in the circle of judgment. The circle of judgment. I'd read about it in the journals. Ancient vampire trial by combat, witnessed by the court, binding until death or surrender. Balin's hand tightened on my back, the only sign of his fury. I've bonded with no one, he said, his voice carrying absolute control. The law of sanctuary is clear. I protect her until the threat is neutralized. Liar. Morrigan's smile was all teeth. I can smell her blood on you. Taste the connection forming between you. You've been feeding from her, strengthening yourself with Van Helsing blood while your supporters die from the poison I've been feeding them for years. She turned to address the court. Your king has betrayed you. Bonded with the enemy. Broken covenant to indulge in forbidden fruit. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Shock, anger, uncertainty. I saw vampires I recognized from the first court gathering, their expressions hardening as Morrigan's accusations found fertile ground in old prejudices. June was taken from her apartment hours ago, Ansel called out, his voice carrying false concern. Despite the protection Balin promised. Despite all his power and resources. He couldn't even keep one human girl safe. What kind of king is that? The psychological warfare was effective. I could see doubt spreading through the court like poison. But worse than that was the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Ansel's revelation back at the tattoo parlor had been incomplete. This had been planned for longer than 18 months. I've been watching you for 2 years, Rhea, Ansel continued, moving closer with June held between him and Morrigan like a shield. Morrigan recruited me specifically to get close to you. Everything, our relationship, the abuse, every moment you thought was real. It was all to make you desperate enough to run into the vampire world. To invoke sanctuary and give her the weapon she needed. 2 years. Every tender moment, every apology, every promise. All of it orchestrated by a 600-year-old vampire who viewed humans as pieces on a chessboard. Even my suffering had been calculated, weaponized, turned into a tool for someone else's ambition. You dare. Balin's voice dropped to something inhuman, something ancient and terrible that made every vampire in the room take an involuntary step back. You dare bring a Van Helsing blood hostage to my court? This is an act of war, Morrigan. Not challenge. War. You brought one into your bed. Morrigan's counter was immediate. I'm simply correcting your mistake. The circle of judgment, Balin. You know the law. Refuse and the court will see you for what you are. A king who breaks covenant when it suits him. The trap was perfect. Fight and risk death while poisoned and weakened. Refuse and lose the court's respect, possibly the throne itself. Either way, Morrigan won. I accept. Balin's words fell like stones into deep water. He turned to me, his crimson eyes holding mine with terrible intensity. Whatever happens, protect your sister. Get her out. Balin. Promise me. I wanted to argue to find another way, but June's terrified eyes over the gag made the choice for me. I promise. The ballroom transformed, vampires forming a circle around the cleared space while ancient rules were invoked in Latin that I only partially understood. Balin removed his jacket with deliberate care, revealing the white shirt beneath, and I saw what I'd missed before. Slight tremors in his hands, a pallor to his skin that shouldn't exist in creatures already pale as marble. The poison was working faster than anyone had realized. Morrigan moved into the circle like a dancer, all lethal grace and predatory confidence. 300 years I've waited for this. 300 years watching you make us weak with your treaties and negotiations and coddling of prey. Tonight the old ways return. The combat began with explosive violence. Two vampires moving faster than my eyes could fully track. Centuries of skill and experience distilled into movements that were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Balin fought with controlled precision, every strike economical and devastating. But Morrigan fought dirty, using speed and viciousness to compensate for her relative youth. And I saw her blade flash, silver coated in something that made Balin hiss when it connected with his shoulder. More poison. She'd coated her weapons with the synthetic blood compound. I couldn't think. I slipped through the watching crowd while all eyes were fixed on the combat, tracking Ansel and June as they moved toward the estate's lower levels. My hunter instincts screamed warnings. This was stupid, reckless, exactly what they wanted. But June was terrified and Ansel was getting away and I was done being the helpless victim everyone expected. The lower levels were wine cellars converted to storage, all stone walls and dim lighting and shadows that moved wrong. I found them in a room that smelled of old wood and older earth. Ansel tying June to a chair with cable ties while my sister fought with every ounce of strength her 19-year-old body possessed. Let her go. My voice was steadier than I felt. This is between us, Ansel. Leave June out of it. He turned slowly and I saw something break across his features. Rage mixed with twisted affection mixed with something that might have been genuine regret. I did love you, Rhea. In my way. But Morrigan offered me immortality, power, a place in the new order she's building. You were always going to be the price. You beat me. Choked me. Terrorized me for a year. I moved closer, letting my hunter instincts guide me, seeing the patterns in his stance that telegraphed his next movement. That's not love. That's ownership. And what's Balin offering? Protection? Security? Ansel laughed, harsh and bitter. He's using you just like I did. Except his cage is gilded and you're too desperate to see it. He lunged. I'd been expecting it, saw the tell in his shoulder, the shift of weight that preceded attack. My body moved without conscious thought, Van Helsing instincts awakening fully for the first time, and I sidestepped with impossible precision. My hand caught his arm and he screamed, my touch burning him like acid, like holy water, like concentrated sunlight. What the? He stared at his arm where my fingers had left red welts. Van Helsing blood. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant, clinical. Natural vampire repellent. But you're not vampire, Ansel. You're just a man who sold his soul for promises of immortality from someone who views you as disposable. The fight was ugly and desperate. Ansel was stronger, trained in combat from his years in sales pitches that occasionally required physical persuasion. But I could see his movements before he made them, could sense the patterns of his attack like reading a book I'd memorized. And when he grabbed June's chair to use as a weapon, when he threatened my baby sister one final time, something in me simply broke. The silver letter opener was in my pocket. I'd taken it from Balin's desk that morning without really understanding why. Now my hand moved with hunter precision and I struck true. The blade found the gap between Ansel's ribs, sliding home with terrible ease, and his eyes went wide with shock. You were always stronger than you believed, he whispered, blood frothing at his lips. That's why she wanted you. That's why. He collapsed and I let him fall, my hands shaking as I freed June from her bonds. Rhea. June's voice was small, traumatized. What's happening? He said you were in danger, that he was helping. Later. Right now we run. But when we burst into the ballroom I realized we were too late. Balin was losing. Morrigan had him on his knees, her blade at his throat, while the assembled court watched in horrified fascination. His skin had taken on a grayish cast, his movements sluggish with poison, and I saw his crimson eyes dimming to something darker. 300 years you've ruled, Morrigan announced, addressing the court rather than her opponent. 300 years of peace and stagnation. Vampires are predators. We were meant to reign, not negotiate with prey. This ends tonight. I pushed through the crowd, still covered in Ansel's blood, and Morrigan's head snapped toward me. You were supposed to be secured. I got unsecured. I moved to Balin's side, ignoring Morrigan's blade. Up close I could see how far gone he was, the poison eating through centuries of accumulated power, leaving him mortal and vulnerable. How do I help? You can't. His voice was barely a whisper. Run, Rhea. Take your sister, Anne. Shut up. I turned my wrist up, showing him the pulse point. Van Helsing blood neutralizes vampire poison. You said it yourself. It's antidote and weapon. So drink. Rhea. I choose you. Not because I have to. Because I want to. I pressed my wrist to his lips. Now drink before she kills us both. The moment his fangs pierced my skin, the world exploded into sensation. His mouth was cold against my heated flesh, and I felt the pull as he drew blood, felt something fundamental shift between us, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Power surged through the connection, not my power flowing to him, but something generated by the union of our bloodlines, ancient magics recognizing each other across centuries of animosity. Balin's eyes blazed back to full crimson as Van Helsing blood flooded his system, neutralizing the poison and doing something more. Enhancing, strengthening, transforming. When he rose to face Morrigan again, he moved with power that made the ancient vampires step back in instinctive recognition. Impossible, Morrigan breathed. Van Helsing blood is poison to our kind. To vampires weakened by synthetic compounds based on incomplete research. Balin's voice carried the weight of 8 centuries. To pure bloodlines, it's the antidote your ancestors spent generations seeking. And you've just given me the weapon to end your rebellion. The final combat was mercifully brief. Morrigan fought with desperate fury, but she was facing a vampire king at full power, enhanced by blood that had hunted his kind for generations and now chose to heal instead. When he offered mercy, exile rather than death, she spat in his face and chose to fight to her end. The court witnessed everything. Saw their king strengthened by Van Helsing blood rather than destroyed. Saw Morrigan's rebellion end in her own blood staining ancient floors. Saw the impossible made manifest. Hunter and hunted choosing each other despite centuries of animosity. But as the adrenaline faded, I saw Balin sway. The poison might be neutralized, but the damage remained. Vampire healing was formidable but not instantaneous, especially when weakened by years of subtle poisoning through his court's compromised blood supply. He needs more than blood. Seraphine appeared beside us, her usual composure strained. He needs a life force transfusion. He needs a bond. Explain. My voice came out sharper than intended. A blood bond. Not transformation, that requires consent and ceremony. But a permanent connection that would let him draw on your life force to heal, that would tie your essences together. She met my eyes steadily. Extended lifespan for you. Supernatural abilities. Permanent connection to Balin. Or we let him heal naturally, months, possibly years of vulnerability while his enemies regroup. The choice was impossible. Accept a permanent supernatural bond to a vampire king I'd known for 5 days. Or leave him vulnerable while chaos filled the power vacuum Morrigan's death had created. Both options terrified me for different reasons. I looked at Balin, silver hair darkened with sweat, crimson eyes holding mine with painful intensity, his hand still holding my wounded wrist with infinite gentleness despite his wounds. I thought about how he'd kept his promises, how he'd given me agency when he could have taken control, how he'd looked at me like I was something precious rather than disposable. What do you want? I asked him directly. I want you safe. His voice was barely audible. I want you free to choose. I want. He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his ancient features. I want you to stay. Not because magic binds you. Because you choose me the way I've chosen you. The honesty devastated me. 5 days ago I'd been running from a man who'd disguised possession as love. Now I stood before a creature who'd lived for 8 centuries offering me genuine choice at the moment when he needed me most. I choose you, I said clearly, loudly enough for the assembled court to hear. Not because I have to, because I want to. Because you've given me something Ansel never did. The freedom to choose and the trust that I'll choose wisely. The bonding ritual was brief but powerful. Ancient words in Latin that Seraphine guided us through while the court bore witness. Exchange of blood freely given on both sides. My wrist to his lips, his wrist to mine, the taste of him like winter nights in old books and something indefinably ancient. Magic recognized magic, hunter blood mixing with vampire essence, creating something new that had never existed before. I didn't become vampire. But I became something more than human. A Van Helsing bonded to the vampire king, chosen rather than turned, partner rather than possession. I felt the change ripple through me, subtle but profound, as if someone had adjusted the frequency I existed on. When we broke apart, both breathing hard despite his lack of need for air, the court erupted in reactions ranging from approval to horror. But I barely noticed. I was too focused on Balin's eyes, blazing crimson once more, full of power and life and something that might have been hope. "Thank you," he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. "For choosing me when you had every reason not to." "Thank you," I replied, "for being worth choosing." Outside, dawn was breaking over Portland. I could feel it somehow. The sun that Balin could never fully experience rising over the city we just saved from civil war. And I realized with strange clarity that I'd started this week running from darkness. Now I stood beside it by choice, no longer afraid because I'd learned to make my own light. 3 months later, winter had descended on Portland with the kind of gentle insistence that made the city's evergreens stand out against gray skies like promises of endurance. Memento Mori had become something neither wholly vampire nor entirely human. A genuine sanctuary where the impossible brushed against the mundane and somehow both survived the contact. I sat in the bookshop's restoration studio, carefully repairing a 15th century grimoire whose pages held spells in languages that predated modern English. My hands moved with practiced precision, but there was something different now. A steadiness that went beyond skill, a certainty in my movements that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I'd become. The bond had changed me in subtle ways. I was still human, still mortal in the ways that mattered, but there was an ethereal quality to my appearance now that made people look twice. My eyes sometimes caught light the way Balin's did, reflecting crimson in certain angles, and I moved through spaces with a grace I'd never possessed before. June was recovering. My baby sister came to visit twice a week, attending therapy sessions with a specialist who understood supernatural trauma and slowly rebuilding the college life that Morrigan's ambitions had shattered. She knew the truth now. About vampires, about our family's history, about the fact that her older sister was bonded to an 800-year-old king. She'd handled it with surprising resilience, declaring that having a vampire king as a brother-in-law was definitely the weirdest thing that's happened to me, but not the worst. Ivy had integrated into the supernatural world with characteristic adaptability, managing Memento Mori's human-facing operations while pursuing an unexpected romance with Lucien that involved a lot of bickering and even more tension-filled glances when they thought no one was watching. She'd moved into an apartment above the bookshop, claiming the commute was convenient, but I suspected she just liked being part of something larger than herself. The Crimson Court had accepted me, not as Balin's protected human or his possession, but as his bonded partner with my own authority. I'd established myself as an intermediary between human and vampire communities, helping newly turned vampires adjust to immortality, mediating disputes that threatened the fragile peace, using my unique position to build bridges that centuries of animosity had burned. Nightshade Pharmaceuticals had been shut down completely, the synthetic blood production stopped, and vampires across the Western Territories were slowly recovering from Morrigan's long poisoning campaign. "You're thinking too loud." Balin's voice came from the studio doorway, rich with amusement and something warmer. "I can feel your mind working from 3 rooms away." I looked up from the grimoire to find him leaning against the doorframe with casual elegance, wearing dark jeans and a gray sweater that made his silver hair seem to glow. 3 months of living together had created an intimacy that went beyond the bond. The easy comfort of knowing someone's rhythms, their preferences, the small gestures that communicated more than words. Just thinking about how much has changed. I set down my restoration tools carefully. 3 months ago I was running for my life. Now I'm repairing grimoires in a supernatural bookshop while my vampire king boyfriend watches me work. Bonded partner, he corrected with that slight smile that still made my pulse quicken. Boyfriend seems insufficient for someone whose life force is tied to yours. Fair point. I stood, moving into his space with the confidence the bond had given me. How was the court session? Tedious. Territorial disputes between vampires who've been feuding since before America was colonized. Sometimes I think immortality's greatest curse is having to arbitrate the same arguments for centuries. He pulled me closer, his cold hands settling at my waist. I much prefer this. Quiet moments with you, watching you work, pretending I understand book restoration. You understand it perfectly. You just like watching me explain things. I traced the line of his jaw, still marveling that I could touch him without fear, without the weight of obligation or possession. Balin, we need to talk about something. His expression shifted subtly. That phrase rarely precedes pleasant conversations. Not unpleasant. Just important. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. You know, the bond doesn't make me immortal. It extends my lifespan, perhaps a century or two, but eventually I'll have to choose. Full transformation or a natural end. The tension in his shoulders was barely perceptible, but 3 months of bonding made me hyper-aware of his emotional state. I won't pressure you, he said quietly. But I'll hope. I've waited 8 centuries for someone like you. I can wait for your decision. I know. And that's exactly why I can take my time deciding. I cupped his face in both hands, making him meet my eyes. I spent so long believing I deserved the pain Ansel gave me. That I'd failed somehow by choosing wrong, by staying too long, by not seeing the warning signs. But I didn't fail. I survived. And then when I was ready, I chose something different. I chose you. And I chose you. His forehead pressed against mine, a gesture that had become our private language of intimacy. Every day I choose you. The bell above the bookshop's entrance chimed, pulling us back to the present. I felt the presence before I saw her. A young woman, maybe 23, with rain-soaked clothes and the kind of fear in her eyes that I recognized on a cellular level. She moved through Memento Mori's entrance like someone walking through a dream, drawn by instincts she didn't understand to a sanctuary she didn't know existed. I was moving before conscious thought, leaving Balin in the studio and approaching her with careful gentleness. Up close, I could see the fingerprint bruises on her throat, the split lip she tried to cover with makeup, the way she flinched when I moved too quickly. You're safe here, I said softly, the same words Balin had offered me 3 months ago. Come inside. I don't know why I'm here. Her voice shook. I was running and I saw the lights and something told me. She trailed off, looking around at the impossible interior with growing confusion. What is this place? A sanctuary. I guided her to the chairs near the restoration studio, aware of Balin watching from the doorway with an expression that held recognition and approval. Tell me what happened. Her story spilled out. Boyfriend who'd seemed perfect at first, gradual escalation of control and violence. Tonight's attack that had finally broken through her denial and sent her running into Portland's winter streets. I listened with the patience born from having lived through similar horrors, and when she finished, I took her hands in mine. You did the right thing by running. You did the right thing by following your instincts to safety. I met her terrified eyes steadily. And you're going to be okay. Not today, maybe not for months, but eventually. I promise. How do you know? Because 3 months ago I was exactly where you are. I showed her my wrist, where Balin's fangs had pierced skin during the bonding ritual, 2 small scars that glowed faintly in certain light. And I survived. More than survived, I found my power again. You will too. We called the police. The human ones, not the supernatural authorities, and connected her with resources that Ivy had helped me compile over the past months. A women's shelter that understood complicated situations. A lawyer who specialized in restraining orders. A therapist who knew how to help survivors rebuild their sense of self. After she left, safely escorted by officers who promised to retrieve her belongings from the apartment she'd shared with her abuser, I stood in Memento Mori's doorway watching winter rain fall on Portland's streets. Balin appeared beside me, his hand finding mine with comfortable familiarity. "You helped her," he observed. "I helped myself 3 months ago by grabbing your hand. Now I get to pay that forward." I leaned against him, feeling the cold that no longer frightened me. The sanctuary continues. The cycle of protection and healing. And you're not afraid anymore. No. I turned to look at him, this impossible creature who'd given me back my agency when he could have taken it. I'm not afraid of the future or my past or my power. I'm not afraid of choosing you, or of the choice I'll eventually make about immortality. I'm not afraid because I know whatever I decide, it will be my decision. And that's what I never had with Ansel, the freedom to choose. We drove back to Blackthorn Estate in comfortable silence, the kind that came from not needing to fill every moment with words. The bond thrummed between us, a constant awareness of each other's emotional state that should have felt invasive but was instead oddly comforting. The sunset from Blackthorn's balcony was spectacular, winter colors painting the Portland skyline in shades of orange and purple that Balin could appreciate but never fully experience without pain. I stood watching the day's end, aware of him joining me as twilight descended, his arms wrapping around me from behind in a gesture that had become ritual. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice a rumble against my back. That I grabbed a stranger's hand in desperation, and found a future I never imagined. I turned in his arms, meeting those crimson eyes that no longer seemed alien or frightening. "Not because you saved me, but because you gave me the space to save myself. And then when I was ready I chose to stand beside you. Not as your protected human. Not as your possession. But as your equal. Your partner. Your choice as you are mine." He kissed me then, soft and deep and full of the promise of time we'd have together. Decades certainly, possibly centuries if I chose transformation, but always on my terms. The sun finished setting behind us, darkness claiming Portland's streets, but I wasn't afraid. I'd learned something essential over the past 3 months. The night didn't have to be feared if you understood it, if you chose it rather than being forced into it, if you had someone beside you who treated your autonomy as sacred. "The bond requires renewal every decade," Balin said quietly, his forehead resting against mine. "Mutual choice to continue. You'll never be trapped with me, Rhea. Every 10 years, you can choose to walk away if you wish." "I know." I smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. "And every decade I'll choose you. Because that's what love is. Not possession or protection, but witnessing someone's full self and choosing them anyway over and over, until choice becomes as natural as breathing." "I love you," he whispered, the words still carrying the weight of centuries spent believing he'd never feel this again. "I love you too." And I meant it with every fiber of my transformed being. Behind us, Memento Mori's lights glowed in the darkness. A beacon for those who needed sanctuary, a bridge between impossible worlds, a promise that survival could lead to something beyond just existing. Somewhere in Portland, the young woman I'd helped tonight was taking her first steps toward reclaiming her life. June was probably studying for midterms while texting her new friends about her weird vampire-adjacent family. Ivy was definitely arguing with Lucien about bookshop management while secretly enjoying every moment. And I stood on a balcony with a vampire king who'd given me back my power by respecting my choices, watching darkness claim a city I'd learned to love, no longer afraid of shadows because I'd discovered how to make them beautiful. The night doesn't frighten me anymore. I've learned that darkness is just another kind of light, one that reveals truths the sun is too bright to show, one that offers sanctuary to those who need to hide before they can heal, one that proves love can exist in impossible spaces if you're brave enough to choose it. I grabbed a stranger's hand in desperation and found my strength, found my purpose, found myself. And that, more than any supernatural bond or ancient magic, was the real transformation.